those preliminaries out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Brian Ó Broin. Dr. Ó Broin received his PhD in medieval literature and languages from the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana after studying at both University College Cork and the National University of Ireland at Galway. Today, he is a professor in the Department of English at William Paterson University in New Jersey. He regularly teaches courses in linguistics, early literature, and modern Irish at WPUNJ. He also tutors and teaches shorter courses in modern Irish in Ireland and in Canada. Dr. Ó Broin's linguistic research focuses on language contact and change among the Irish-speaking populations in the United States and Ireland. He has also done work on the acquisition of Irish and its dual role as a recognized working language of the Irish Republic and an endangered minority language. Other professional interests of his include language and technology and language pedagogy. In addition to his Celtic linguistic pursuits, Dr. Ó Broin has written award-winning plays, a book on minority language parenting, and several prize-winning Irish medium novels for young people. He also frequently appears on Irish radio as a commentator on American politics and culture. So please join me in welcoming our man of many hats, Dr. Brian Ó Broin.
Hello. Okay, yeah, there we go with the ASL. I'm unfamiliar with that. I love it though. Wow. Now I'm very nervous. That introduction really just makes my knees quiver a little. I thought, who is this person who's done all this research on language contact and so on? Really, if I sent you that information, Kerry, I apologize. I am not even half that scholar, alas. Particularly here I am in the presence of world-class linguists like Andrew Carney and Mike Hammond, and Kevin Scannell, I see, is in from St. Louis as well. So, well, all I can do is humbly present what I have here, and hopefully you won't be too horrified, particularly the programmers. Actually, if you will allow me blow my own horn, my first children's, well, it's a teenager's novel in Irish, is available for pre-order as of yesterday from the Connemara publisher Leabhar Breac, and it's an adventure novel involving two New York kids who find themselves at the center of an archaeological dig in the center of Ireland where things are being stolen, and they have to get to the bottom of things. It's international, it's exciting, and spread the word. So anyway, more to the point is the paper today, which is a comparative analysis of City and Gaeltacht Irish, with a particular look at syntax and lexicon. But I was thinking of Kerry, so I'm keeping my portion on phonology in, because I think she'll be interested in that, and I think the rest of you will be too. Now, hopefully you can see my opening slide there, can you? Excellent. Now, it was partially the Irish government's, oh dear me, I'm going to have to, restart this again. There we are. There we go. Are you able to see that slide without anything in the way? Because of course, because I'm hosting, I can see several other windows on top of it here. But as long as your screens are clear, that's fine. There we go. Okay, it was the Irish government's 20-year strategy for the Irish language that inspired me to do this paper. And when I read the various drafts that came out, and indeed the finalized document, I realized that the Irish government was planning to do the same thing that it has been doing since 1922, which is viewing the language as something to be contained and preserved in the quasi-Indian reservation we call a Gaeltacht, but certainly not fostering the language outside the Gaeltacht, except as an emblematic second language learned at school. Now, there's a considerable amount of support for this approach and this view with government agencies and myopic linguists delighted to see the fate of Irish as binary. I told you I was going to mention binary statuses, Andrew. It's either there, green, or it's not, white space, or empty space. Now, anyone who knows Ireland knows that the language situation is non-binary. Thanks to the Irish education system, which also explains the weak figures in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland there, there's actually a very significant number of self-identified speakers, even native speakers, all over the country. There's so many of them, in fact, that Ireland's 2 largest cities, Belfast and Dublin, have their own Irish language radio stations. Radio Fáilte, which is newly headquartered in Belfast's ugliest building, and Radio na Liffey, which is headquartered in the Forest na Gaeilge offices on Merrion Square in Dublin. And of course, there's Radio na Gaeltacht, which broadcasts nationally from the Gaeltacht. And furthermore, viewership figures for TG4, the Irish language TV station, confirm that the overwhelming majority of their viewers come from outside the Gaeltacht. I felt inspired to investigate the types of Irish being spoken outside the Gaeltacht, particularly in the cases of Dublin and Belfast, but also partially Cork. There was clear evidence that Irish speakers raised in these cities were identifiable dialectically. And I set about looking at their Irishes. Now, you might argue that all we're seeing here is the effect of strong Dublin and Belfast English accents bleeding over into the second language. But surely, if you think about it, this is how every dialect begins, under the influence of an already present native language. But how to go about a systematic analysis of these? I elected to use the usual 4 linguistic features used to formally analyze language: phonetics or phonology, morphology, syntax, and lexicon. Now that I had settled on what linguistic areas I was going to examine, the next question concerned my subjects. Who was I going to use for data? Now, in an ideal world, obviously, I would find a sufficient number of native speakers from each community. I would ensure their approximate comparability in things like age, gender, socioeconomic background, education, and the like. And I would then interview them on a subject that would ensure they would all speak unconsciously and at length. I find asking respondents to describe exciting events in their lives, such as weddings, accidents, vacations, etc., always guarantees good results. Now, unfortunately, this really isn't possible without extraordinary resources. Even if I had the time and the money to physically trawl the Gaeltacht and the cities for several weeks or months in search of speakers, I'm not sure I'd find enough respondents happy to let me stick a microphone in their faces and record them in a controlled environment. Now, the solution leapt at me from my old friend, the Wi-Fi radio in my kitchen. Why couldn't I use broadcasters? There were 3 radio stations, all of them streaming live over the internet, and all of them employing young, articulate presenters, presumably chosen for their comparatively good command of Irish. In an imperfect world, and I understand how imperfect this approach is, by the way, that seemed like the best approach. Now, a friend has suggested to me lately, particularly in the case of Radio na Gaeltacht, that these broadcasters might not represent the standard speech of ordinary speakers, and I'm inclined to partially agree. So I have been gradually sliding over into not just recording broadcasters associated with these radio stations, but interviewees, with the caveat that they not be involved in any but the most casual way with the Irish language movement. That is, they just happen to be ordinary people who speak Irish. But even then, what kind of speech was I going to analyze? So I elected to identify two baselines, which I considered would be good examples of carefully spoken, prepared speech, that of newsreaders. And with these baselines for comparison, I could then find other examples of spoken Irish, again in controlled environments. In this case, I chose presenters of chat shows on the radio stations, delivering extempore monologues at the beginning of their shows. Now, in each case also, I chose presenters from the Gaeltacht, from Belfast, and from Dublin. Now, there have been other programs and stations starting to develop in other cities. Galway, for instance, is experimenting with its own radio station, Radio Nidrav, the radio of the tribes, but I haven't been able to capture anything from them yet. So in any case, in each case, I took a 5-minute recording and transcribed it. And I then analyzed it using the categories I've already described. Now, here's where I must put in a major caveat here. This is not a comparison of native speakers and learners. Anyone who, actually, I just experienced this 10 minutes ago. If you ask an Irish speaker, are you a native speaker? They'll hum and they'll haw, and some people, particularly from the cities, will sometimes say they're native speakers when they aren't, for fear of being judged harshly. So I chose my speakers not on what language they spoke at home, which wasn't anything I could prove, but what language they were speaking in front of the microphone. That said, I did find several speakers whom I knew to be native speakers, and I have paid some special attention to them, and we'll see some analysis of them presently. Firstly, phonetics or phonology. A complete phonetic analysis was, of course, out of the question, but it occurred to me that I could use certain markers as reliable representations of the speaker's phonetic range. So I elected to examine just 3 particular markers in the Irish language: slender dentals, unvoiced velar fricatives, and unvoiced palatal fricatives. And you'll see some examples there. So a slender dental, the first word there is pronounced didium. You might call it a tight T or a tight D on the teeth. Unvoiced velar fricatives, an huach, mochra, ach, and unvoiced palatal fricatives, an heish, glan hio, sroid hiosha. Now, in the third case there, I do acknowledge that might be partially alveolar. Now, all of these have the advantage of being sounds that are not made in English, and that's an important point here. And they are nevertheless necessary for Irish grammar. That is to say, a slender consonant at the end of a word can indicate plurality. A lenited consonant at the beginning of a word can mark gender. So these features are important as not just phonetic features, but for marking morphology as well. So their presence or otherwise would therefore be a good indication of the relative health of the speaker's dialect. I don't know if health is the right word to use there. I'm not trying to imply that anyone is speaking a form of sick Irish or something. So perhaps I should change that word. In this case, anyway, I used a little visual basic code to mark up all examples of these sounds in the transcriptions. I just have an example here in front of you. And then I simply went through the recording acoustically item by item, counting up the relevant sounds that the speaker made or missed. So you'll see the dentals there in red, the velar fricatives in green, and the palatal fricatives in blue. Now, of course, I acknowledge this, every listener is fallible, and it's entirely possible that you might hear these sounds different from how I hear them. But as long as the same listener is doing the markup, he's always going to be making the same errors. That is, while the figures for each discrete speaker might be unreliable when they stand alone, as comparisons of each other, they're 100% accurate as long as the same listener is doing the evaluation. Morphological analysis. This was thankfully a little less subjective. Again, a complete morphological analysis was impossible. So I elected to examine a single category, nouns whose morphology had changed from the base form. So, as an example there in front of you, for the base word cantor, which means speaker, which is a masculine noun of the third declension, I marked all occurrences of its variant forms. Gantor, cantora, chantora, cantori, gantori, chantori. And I counted as missed any instances where the expected change did not occur. Again, using the technique I used for phonetics, I went through each recording and I judged each word as made or missed. Now, you'll see there are two colors there because I had started out with a particular interest in the genitive, and the words marked in green there are genitives, but in the end I discarded that, but the green still remains on the image there. Now, syntax, God help us all, syntax. Need I tell you that this category made me tear my hair out? It was a category I stayed away from for as long as I possibly could. How does one judge the syntactic quality, standard, or level of a speaker's utterances? The answer, you'll be glad to know, came straight from God. Or more accurately, the pens of several hundred Midwestern nuns. I'm sure several of you have heard of the nun study, perhaps not. This is and by the way, I am not interested in Nicole and the can-can, so take your eyes off her. This was a longitudinal study undertaken by Dr. David Snowden of the University of Minnesota to study the onset of Alzheimer's disease. All members of the order, this holy order, were required to write a personal essay just before they took final vows. And these essays were all preserved in the order's archives. Snowden analyzed the essays to see if the syntactic structure of the essays could in any way predict Alzheimer's disease in later life. And he indeed found that it seemed that there was a marked syntactic difference between nuns who were going to develop Alzheimer's and those who were not. And he used the concepts of idea density and grammatical complexity. Lower scores in these two categories could often predict Alzheimer's. Now, that wasn't actually my goal, but could I use these linguistic measurement techniques on my transcriptions? Why not? They were originally developed to analyze language development in children and the intellectually disabled. And they have, since they were developed in the 70s and 80s, been used in many different situations since. So why not use them to analyze linguistic abilities in adult speakers? idea density. Previous studies have suggested that idea density is associated with educational level, vocabulary, and general knowledge. However, grammatical complexity is associated with working memory, performance on speeded tasks, and writing skill. Now, of the two, I think I'd prefer to use the latter, grammatical complexity, and that's probably a good thing, as idea density is extremely difficult and time-consuming to encode. Idea density is defined as the average number of ideas expressed per 10 words. Ideas correspond to elementary propositions, typically a verb, adjective, adverb, or prepositional phrase. But then you have complex propositions that state or infer causal, temporal, or other relationships between ideas. And approaching that and analyzing somewhere in the region of 15 long 1,000-word texts, it was impossible, it was unfeasible. Now, grammatical complexity was an approach developed by Sheldon Rosenberg, and Leonard Abaduto in 1987. And this approach has been refined several times in the following decades. And this seems a little more measurable. Basically, using a scale from 0 to 7, where 0 designates a very simple sentence and 7 designates a very complex sentence containing embedding at multiple levels, texts were analyzed sentence by sentence, and an average was calculated for each sentence and then for each text. Now, here's where things get tricky. The Rosenberg and Abaduto approach is specific to English. Can it be adapted to Irish? Let's have a look at one of the latest revisions of the technique. This is from Michael Covington in the University of Georgia. So here's some, and I apologize for the size of this text. I understand it's unfeasibly small. I sincerely apologize. But you can see that you have level 0 sentences, the dog barked, and I'll just go on to the next slide here, up to level 7 sentences, where you can see more than one level of embedding in a single sentence. John decided to leave Mary when he heard that she was seeing Mark. So there's a fair amount of phrase and clausal embedding going on in that sentence. Now, wouldn't it be lovely if we could simply convert the whole lot to Irish and have done? It'd be great. Wow. But that is not possible, as I'm sure you all agree. We can certainly keep simple sentences. Actually, sorry, I'm going to stop for a second because I threw a third slide in at the last moment. And this sort of simplifies his approach. Level 0, simple sentence. Level 7, more than one structure of levels 1 to 6, but with embedding. And you'll see there are various stages of complexity in between those two. Now, in Irish, we can certainly still keep simple sentences at level 0 and complex ones at level 7. But what about the other 6 levels? Irish, for instance, doesn't have infinitives or participles. So what do we do about level 1, which sort of expects participles? So you can see there, sorry again to put this tiny text slide back at you. How do we solve that problem? Irish doesn't have raising, and nominalization certainly doesn't happen in Irish exactly like it does in English. So what do we do with level 4? Again, sorry about this. What do we do with transformations that happen in Irish but not in English? And I know that's going to interest Andrew Carney, because I saw an article from him about those sneaky, non-finite verbal phrases that push the verb to the end of the phrase. How complex is the verbal noun in Irish? How complex is the infixed pronoun, which we still have in Irish? Now, as we now know, a great deal of Rosenberg and Abaduto's classification system involved guesswork, hence these several revisions that have come out since. And I do admit some of my approach here is educated guesswork. Some of it comes from the transcriptions that I have of native speaking children and adolescents, but until we have a comprehensive, searchable language database of Irish speaking children, this adaptation is going to remain partially guesswork. Now, here's how I've adapted the scale at the lower end here. So you can see I've kept some examples of simple sentences. The dog barked, rinne on Madra Toffin. I'm going to keep that as a level 0. We've had to abandon the idea of having infinitives, but we certainly have plenty of non-finite phrases in Irish that involve verbal nouns, and they are very commonly used by children from early days. I was willing to keep sentences like that at level 1. And here's how I've adapted at the higher stage here. And you can see that I've, for example, taken the liberty of including infixed pronouns, which simply don't exist in English, at level 5 of Irish. And I'm still not sure about that. Part of me wants to push it up to level 6, but I'm keeping it at level 5 for the time being. And you can see I have a typical Irish sentence here for level 7, which involves phrases and clauses being embedded up to 3 levels there, in the same way as the English sentences. Now, using this classification system, I then went through the first 10 sentences, or utterances, if you like, from each transcription, and I averaged out the complexity. Now, here's an example of the encoding of one text. That's a level 7 utterance there. I was going to apologize for not including a translation, but I actually do have a translation there. You can see the phrase, not to buy goods from Israel, embedded in the phrase of asking consumers not to buy goods from Israel, embedded in the relative clause that I was tired of asking consumers, etc., embedded in the whole sentence. And here's how I then approached a typical text and calculated complexity. This is a text from one of the urban newsreaders, and you can see each sentence gets a score from 0 up to 4 in this case. Now, in addition to the transcribed news reports and chat monologues that I recorded and transcribed, I also added 2 items because I wanted to establish benchmarks. The first was a popular idiomatic version of Jack and the Beanstalk, written by Mairead Ní for children, with which I was hoping to get a score that would reflect the lowest realistic score that a coherent text might get. And the second was a passage from Máirtín O'Kine's short story, Ceacu. And if you haven't heard of Máirtín O'Kine, he's a well-known short story writer and novelist from Connemara. His best-known work is Craine Kille, Graveyard Soil, which is even now a bestseller. And I felt quite arbitrarily that an extract from that short story would represent a very complex text. So out of my 0 to 7 scale, the children's story scored 0.9 and the O'Kine text scored 4.35. So at least we have an idea that there is a strong, there's plenty of space between those two texts. Now, lexicon. I was curious about the vocabulary of the speakers. Prevailing thinking might assume that Gaeltacht speakers would have a wider vocabulary than urban speakers, but my own experience suggests that urban speakers often compensate for their lack of idiom by having expanded vocabularies, often using neologisms. So an urban driver, for instance, might sky, overtake a car, but a Gaeltacht speaker would most likely go harish, pass it by. That is to say, one of these words is a neologism and the other is an idiom. A further issue we have here is the difficulty we have with counting vocabulary. We first of all need some way of stripping Irish words of their morphological peculiarities. That is to say, we need a lematizer which can reduce words to their roots. So for example, gantori gets reduced to its base form cantor, hócin gets reduced to its base form tog, áille, which is the plural form of the adjective there, gets reduced to its base form áin, and aguin gets reduced to the base preposition egg. That done, we then go through our text with a list of stop words. That is to say, words that are too commonplace to bother counting. In English, for example, this list would include the verbs to be and to have, the modal auxiliaries, the prepositions, many adverbs, numbers, days of the week, pronouns, and so forth. The typical English stop word list comes to between 150 and 200 words. In Irish, the matter is slightly more difficult. While there are only 6 or so separate forms of the verb to be in English, there are about 60 separate forms of the verb to be in Irish. Regarding prepositions, in Irish, we have to take into account all of the prepositional pronoun forms. So about 7 times the number of prepositions in Ireland have to be encoded. An Irish stop word list would probably come to well over 1,000 words, and that's a conservative estimate. Having lemmatized our text and removed the stop words, we then need to remove all duplicates. Only then can we actually count the text's lexicon. Now, Kevin Scannell is there, or he was. He greatly obliged me by sending me an Irish frequency list as I was working on this project. And he also tells me that a lemmatizer kind of exists for Irish, but it will only function on Linux systems with several peculiar compilers installed. So I haven't taken that approach yet. And the only stop list I've been able to find is a 164 item list of perhaps 15 or 20 of the most common prepositions. That isn't going to cut it. So in other words, my heart sank. It sank to think that I ever even suggested that I was going to discuss lexicon today. But it was a good excuse for me to introduce myself to Python, hello Michael, and NLTK, the Natural Language Toolkit. And I decided for a lark, Kevin's going to kill me, this isn't his fault, I came up with this idea. I decided for a lark to use the top 6,000 words of Kevin's frequency list and cut them out of my texts using a simplish Python script. Why 6,000? Why 6,000? That is a vast number. Well, it seemed to me that that was a kind of a sweet spot. Somewhere about there you can see there's about the 6,000 point of the frequency list there. Vocabulary ceased to be completely simple, and it began to move into the territory of intermediate and advanced speaker territory. Be aware, as you can see there, this frequency list also includes mutated forms. Now, I was glad to see that my two benchmark texts, the children's story and the Mortzin O'Kine short story, gave me, after running these scripts on them, the following figures. The Mortzin O'Kine short story had a lexical richness of 19%, and the children's text had a lexical richness of 4.5%. Now I can keenly aware that I don't have a great deal of time left, so I'm going to shoot through my findings. Phonetics, quickly. You'll see that my baseline figures for news reports in Gaeltacht and City Irish show a significant gap here. Gaeltacht newsreaders never missed more than 7% of any expected feature, while the lowest figure for City newsreaders was 14%. And as you can see there, it was as high as 66% for palatals. These figures were mirrored in the off-the-cuff speakers. Gaeltacht speakers never missed more than 8% of any feature, while City speakers never missed less than 31% of any feature. And what I thought was remarkable, they missed 100% of the palatals. So Kerry, there's a project for you right there. What's going on with the palatals in urban Irish? And now, this would mean little in languages such as English, where phonetics and morphology do not intersect quite so sharply, but the implications for Irish are serious. If speakers are unable to dependably lenite or eclipse, case forms such as the genitive plural and tense forms such as the perfect, well, I should say past tense, sorry, are liable to get lost because there is no way of marking them phonetically anymore. And this bodes ill for the Irish morphological system. And I don't really see much to replace it yet, apart from maybe syntactic solutions that urban speakers are developing on the fly. Now, on the bright side, where there's an acceptable pronunciation of an Irish sound using English phonetics, speakers will tend to make the English sound. Purists may decry this process. I can see why. City Irish is apparently rejecting any elements of the Irish phonetic system that don't have an equivalent in English. Morphology. Well, I don't think it's any surprise that given what we've seen in the phonetics findings there's going to be a knock-on effect on morphology. If speakers cannot accurately pronounce a genitive or a past tense, they are likely to drop out of these features are likely to drop out of the grammatical system. I only paid attention to nouns. Now you'll see that the baseline figure for nouns missed in Gaeltacht newsreaders was 2%. And even non-professional Gaeltacht speakers, and I'm sorry I don't have the figure on that in that chart there, even non-professional speakers never missed more than 7%. City speakers, however, had a newsreader rate of between 23% and 40%, and relaxed urban broadcasters missed anything between 43% and 82% of expected changes. That's radical. That's quite a strong change. I had a few other things to say about morphology, but I want to jump onto syntax. What about syntactic complexity? And I've been working on syntactic complexity for the last 2 months, so please allow me present my crazy figures. Now, complexity findings for syntax. You will see that the Gaeltacht newsreaders came in well ahead of the pack for complexity measures. That's the 2 blue lines at the bottom of the chart there, with both newsreaders, and I thought this was interesting, actually exceeding the complexity benchmark that I had for Mortsin O'Kine. That was the short story. Note, however, the urban interloper. That's the green line at the very bottom there. Yes, he is quite a high syntactic rate, and that's speaking off the cuff. Now, in the meantime, I'm pretty sure that he is a native speaker of Irish. I was telling you I was going to mention that. And this suggests to me that if you're being raised in Irish in the city, you are able to achieve syntactic levels every bit as complex as speakers from anywhere else. Okay. For chat shows, the data was very different, and it was quite challenging for current assumptions. The only speaker to exceed the upper benchmark text at all was an urban speaker. The next highest speaker was also an urban speaker, and the next highest after that was a tie between an urban speaker and a Gaeltacht speaker. This suggests very strongly to me that at least in extempore speech situations, urban native speakers are speaking with a possibly higher level of complexity than their Gaeltacht equivalents. And this is such a surprising finding for me that I feel obliged to thoroughly re-examine my methodology here. Now, Lexicon, and you'll be glad to know I'm almost finished, just another 60 seconds or so. I was so pleased with my benchmark figures for Lexicon that I assumed I would see a predictable pattern when I ran my routine over all my texts. Not so, I think. If there is a pattern, it's surprising. The lowest lexical richness figure I had outside of the benchmarks was that of a Gaeltacht chat show. And the top 7 items for lexical richness were all urban, with 5 of them being news programs. I have no ready explanation for this, except for this. Here's a transcript of one of the urban recordings. I'm sorry about all this text, but I'm sure you can see some interesting stuff jumping out already. Rudolph Hess, John Huston, James Baldwin, Bon Jovi, Hey Joe, Jimi Hendrix Experience. You will remember that I was comparing these texts to a frequency chart for just Irish words. It had been cleaned of all Irish words. I suspect that we would get different figures if we could clean our data of English words and of non-Irish proper nouns. Conclusions in a hurry. Number 1, Urban Irish phonetics seems to be now primarily based on the English phonetic system. Morphology. Urban Irish morphology is following suit, and it's altering rapidly. Gender, case, tense, and all other morphological processes are being affected. Syntax seems to be unaffected. particularly in the case of urban native speakers, it was clear that urban native speakers were demonstrating the same syntactic complexity as anybody from the Gaeltacht. And finally, there were very high rates of lexical richness from urban speakers. In sum, urban Irish is at least phonetically and morphologically a Creole. I hate to use that word, but it seems to be the case. And it's an unstable pidgin among non-natives, but it remains syntactically and lexically comparable to Gaeltacht Irish. And that's where I will leave things. And I apologize, I went 5 minutes over my target, but there you are. We'll leave things at that.
All right, everybody, let's thank our speaker. Practice not sign language. Thank you so much, Brian. That was absolutely fantastic. And we have collected a couple questions that popped up in the chat. If any more come to mind as I'm presenting Brian with these, go ahead and pop those down in the chat and our students will keep an eye on it. All right, our first question is from Andrew, and I believe it's Andrew Carney, if he wants to unmute himself and read it. It's quite lengthy unless he dipped.
I'll make it shorter.
Okay, go for it.
Brian, that was a fantastic talk, really interesting. I have a question you will not be surprised to know about syntactic complexity. I think your methodology is quite sound, but I have a question about whether it's predicting the right things, because I'm not sure if you're familiar with this distinction that is made across typological domains between parataxis, which is languages that chain sentences one next to each other, and hypotaxis, yes, where there's embedding. And the late Ken Hale, I was trying to see if there was a reference for this, and I haven't been able to find a reference, but the late Ken Hale used to say that the difference between paratactic languages and hypotactic languages was one of literacy. So languages that were primarily spoken languages and not written languages were largely paratactic, and languages that had literary traditions exhibited hypotaxis. And one of the things I was wondering, and I'm not sure you could show this in Irish because Irish education is obligatory, is whether or not there's a correlation with the literacy of the speakers as to how much complexity they put into it. So, if you could find an Irish speaker that wasn't literate in Irish, I would be interested to see if they are also hypotactic. This might be easier to do in another Celtic language where education is not obligatory in the language.
Yeah, I doubt that is measurable using the speakers available to me, or at least the speakers I have. Everybody I recorded there went through the same educational system, and even inside the Gaeltacht, the educational system is almost the same. Now, this might be an interesting challenge for somebody interested in comparing the Irish of speakers who have been sent to Gaelscoileanna, which are Irish medium schools, where all the textbooks are going to be in Irish and all the instruction is going to be in Irish, and those who have gone to English medium schools, and to see if their Irishes can be distinguished in any way. But my feeling is from the knowledge I have of all the broadcasters, and I actually have friends who work on all three of these radio stations, their educational levels seem to be comparable. But as I say, taking this Rosenberg and Abaduto system, which is based on English, and just manhandling it into Irish, may be a problematic approach. I'm aware of that. It may actually be that Irish speakers handle clauses and verbal phrases in a completely different way. So I have to say your point is well taken. I absolutely agree. The approach could be problematic if we assume syntactic systems that might not be as clause dependent, let's say, in Irish as in English.
Thank you.
All right, our next question is from Mike Hammond. He asks, can complexity be measured by average number of verbs per sentence? And actually, Mike, go ahead and...
Sorry, I threw in like 6 questions there. And given the time, what I'd like to do is ask just one, but not that one.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, so first, awesome talk. Second, the question I'm actually interested in is based on, I think, an observation of the Gaelic speaker that we work with here. And I might be misquoting her or misstating her position, so somebody can stop me if I'm saying it wrong. But I think she made the observation, this is for speakers of Gaelic on the Isle of Skye, that the fluent native speakers code switch all the time. Yep. But the learners are like rigorous in avoiding it.
Yes.
So is the same true in Irish?
Absolutely. I'm sure there are several observers here who participate in the Gaeltacht Irish discussion forum on Facebook. And can I call them Karens? Is it okay to call them Karens? There are several Irish language purists hovering over the list at all times, monitoring speakers for any deviation from Irish and slapping people on the wrists when they use English. And these are 100% non-native speakers of English. They are all from non-native traditions, and they somehow believe that there's this thing called pure Irish, which has been sullied by English. And our job is to rake out all those horrible English words and come up with a pure Irish alternative. And of course, it isn't possible. A living language always borrows from whatever language is around it. And as far as I'm concerned, those code switching native speakers are more genuinely Irish speakers than the purists who refuse to speak anything
so then to make the question, would you expect a difference in the rate of code switching between your urban and the other guys?
Interestingly, if you aren't a language activist, if you're just like an Irish speaker in the cities, you are, I think, going to have no problem throwing English in. Is my screen still being shared there?
Yeah. Yes.
Let's see, can I call up a text here very quickly? This is a Dublin chat speaker. Hopefully you can see this. And let's see, I don't know if you can see the English there at all. Unfortunately, the text is, there's an awful lot of text here. Where is her story at all? Curses. I think it's the wrong text, but she kept on throwing things, throwing English phrases in. Cred, no, cred, get this. Who am I, she said, and who did I see? Ah, Kevin Scannell Shul in show. So there's and it was a perfectly natural code switching process, but it is hit and miss with the urban speakers. The purists are much more likely to keep all the English out as much as they can. So, however, Mike, you also asked there, can complexity be measured by average number of...
Oh, sorry, that was just an attempt to have a simpler complexity measure if you were interested, just whether you could simply count, the verb, non-verb ratio in sentences as a simpler measure.
it's interesting. Allow me, if I can, to call up another document here, which was my revision of Rosenberg and Abeduto. I guess it must be open in there somewhere already. There it is. And again, I'm awfully sorry for the size of this text. I'll scroll down, I'll make the text a bit larger. And here we have, for instance, a low scoring long sentence here. I'm just going to make the text a bit larger because I know you can't see that the way it is. And basically what we have here is a daisy chain of he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and she went there, and such a thing happened here, and I also did this, and blah, 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 blah. So in that sentence, you might actually, and I can't count them here, but I would say you probably have 10 or 15 verbs, and yet on the Rosenberg and Abeduto scale, that sentence got 0.
This goes back to Andrew's point.
Yes, it does. Am I being unfair to that speaker by scoring that sentence 0?
Don't know. Yeah.
I don't know.
Very nice. Very nice. Thank you.
Sorry that I can't. Sorry.
No, excellent. Thank you.
It's a tough question to answer because it is understandable. Can we take the English syntactic system and analyze the Irish one with it? Maybe, maybe not.
Thank you.
All right. Our next two questions came from Andrew Kearney and Kevin Scannell, who have resources that they are interested in sharing with you. Brian.
Yes. I see Andrew mentions the Ethna Guilfoyle corpus, and I think she's put all of that stuff up on the Childis corpus, am I right?
Yes.
I don't know if she has added to her corpus since the 80s or the 90s, has she?
No, she hasn't. She's been a university administrator.
It's interesting you say that because it was actually her corpus I was using as I was scoring these sentences. And some recordings I have of other children and adolescents who are native speakers. But if people aren't familiar with the Childis corpus, I'm just going to write Childis here, Childes. It is a fantastic resource for transcriptions of children speaking, if you're interested in a project. And there is a measurable number of Irish recordings there. Kevin? Yes. Elaine's POS tagger. As I say, I think it's only available on the Linux system. Am I right?
You can, with a little wrestling, you can get it to work on Windows or elsewhere.
Okay. How much wrestling?
It is admittedly, it's a lot of wrestling. Yeah, it's not easy to get working, but
okay. Is it as
well
complicated as the WWF?
The what?
That televised wrestling where they throw each other around the rings.
Oh, that wrestling. Yeah.
As I actually had a look at her stuff, and I said, at this stage of my introduction to NLTK and so on, this is too much for me. But it is worth a try. And I apologize to you for having taken the top 6,000 words of that frequency list and thus making you an accomplice in that very, very rough approach to lexical richness. And I understand you would probably scream and run away if you were in the room.
Since I'm unmuted, is there time for one more question?
Go for it.
Sorry, I'm really interested in Mike Hammond's comment about redundant versus non-redundant contexts. I looked at this last year for Irish and was able to show more or less that virtually all of the initial mutations in Irish are redundant to some degree, more or less by training a neural network to predict them, even having taken them out of a text.
Yes.
So just to amplify that, right? So Right. So if you have like a multi-word kind of thing, like there's I'm just going to generalize from Gaelic to Irish because I know virtually nothing about Irish. But like when I think about Gaelic, there's the cases of a mutation that's correlated with an overt trigger that's adjacent and overt. And then there's the cases of mutation where it's like covert or far away. And so I wonder, just like that distinction, does that make a difference in the distribution of these?
Kevin?
Oh yeah. So in my work, believe it or not, it's extremely rare for any of them to carry any information content, basically. To a certain extent, the third person possessives, which mark gender,
Yes,
those are the hardest to predict, as you might expect. But
well,
even those, a lot of the time, can be predicted from surrounding context. So
yes.
I don't have to put an H in front. It really, I mean, a speaker would know that it's
Right.
a feminine possessor just based on surrounding context.
Well,
So that was the upshot, and it works for Gaelic too. It's Scottish and Irish Gaelic.
along those lines, historical linguists argue that the Irish mutation system wasn't always there. That possibly in the pre-medieval world or even earlier, the Celtic languages had either either no mutation system or a highly simplified one. And the point here, I guess, is it seems possible that the urban speakers can get along just fine without the morphology and the phonetics. It seems to be the case.
I mean, there is another, sorry, just to go back to the, I'm intruding. Carrie, do you want to shut me up? You can shut me up, Carrie.
Okay, if it's super fast, because I have a question and we're over time. So
Carrie,
fast.
you ask. No, you ask yours.
Okay.
Go for it.
So I apologize, everybody. It's after our hour, so if you have to dip out, that's totally okay. I just have one more question for Brian. If I can pull it up, I typed it out because I was nervous about this. Okay, so Dr. Broin, you mentioned that urban speakers have highly identifiable speech, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. But then you went on to mention pigeons and creoles, and I was just wondering if you think it's possible that there exists an urban dialect of Irish, or that one will develop now that we're seeing more younger native speakers living in these urban areas.
Well, no, that is a big question because, you know, if you were to, for instance, analyze Quebec French, it was much more obviously a Creole 2 or 3 generations ago. It seems to have slightly decreolized in the meantime. And my question would be, is if Irish continues to grow in the urban zones, are these zones going to develop their own creoles, or are they going to de-creolize in the direction of the Gaeltacht or some sort of a standardized central dialect? My suspicion is we're going to end up with a situation rather like German, where people will have their own home dialects or their own urban dialects, but in any situations outside of those, they will use a standardized Irish. So essentially code switching. But that said, I think there's a strong possibility of, well, I think it exists, at least putatively. I think urban Creoles exist in Dublin and Belfast. They only have a few hundred speakers, but they exist.